Hello and welcome to week 12 of the ARK map development series. And this week we'll be going over all things supply drops and how to get them started in your map. So the first thing I want to highlight is that supply drops should be on their own level. Unlike the other things that we've done thus far in the map, where we have specified sections based on island location, such as the dino spawns for Island 1 or the foliage for Island 1, the supply drops are going to be done on a level for map-wide basis, thus creating a situation where you could be up on a hill, such as this, and see a supply drop going down on a different island. So that is the reason why we keep them on a separate level. Additionally, it does also create some performance issues if you're loading them out and in and out and in. So it's best to keep them out and load them when the player needs them. We're going to need a few things to set up our supply drops. The first thing I would do is create a folder in your scene outlier, because the supply drops, among other things, can get really messy. So what I'm actually going to do is hide all my other stuff. I just have things from my persistent level now, which is mostly mountains, landscapes, and some of the other things that I need for like physics and whatnot. Now, I've done this before to test it out, because as we get into the finer points of the ARK development kit, some of the things get a little more complicated. But I will show you how to do every step and make sure that everybody's on the same page. We need two different parts to allow supply drops to happen in game, and we'll talk about what each of them are and what they're doing individually. So the first thing that we need after we create our folder for supply drops, because as I said, this can get messy, is we're going to need a supply crate spawning volume. So back in early days of ARK, they weren't drops that came out of the sky. They were literally crates that spawned on the beaches. If you've ever played the island in the early days, or even some of Ragnarok, you've come across some of these crates that just spawn on the beaches. So if we start to search supply crate, we'll see that we have all these different static meshes and everything, but what we actually need is the supply crate, and if we put a space here, we should see spawning settings and spawning volumes. We need to click and drag a spawning volume into our selected map, which is our supply drops. We're going to create this, and we're going to move this onto a location where we will eventually set up supply crates to come down. So I'm going to do this tiny island over here, which we haven't visited yet. But we're going to create a spawning volume for this and some of the outlying area around it in the water. So we're going to click and drag this spawning volume in, and we'll see if we zoom in on it. It's actually really tiny to start. That's perfectly fine. We'll zoom back out a little bit. We'll just scale it out to about the size of the island. We can keep these pretty tame in size. We don't need to make them the size of the whole map. That'll really affect performance. But if we keep them to be, roughly the size of our islands and the areas that we're spawning them in, we should be good, right? We don't want to spawn something at the bottom of the ocean all the way down in a dark spot here. We want to spawn something that's near an island that is accessible for a player, because these are really a way to jumpstart the player. So we have this area that we want it to spawn in. We're going to have to set a few settings here on this supply crate spawning volume in order to get it to work. But in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit about how the supply crates work in ARK. So if we go back to our game here in our content browser over here, and again we search that supply, and we see all these supply crates and the alien supply crates and all that jazz. We're going to right click here and hit this find asset and tree on one of the supply crates, just so we can go see the folder that houses all of them. And we'll notice that there are different supply crates for different maps, because they hold different item sets. We'll notice that each of them has a normal one. So we have supply crate level 30, and we also have supply crate level 30 double. So we start, and we'll get into this a little bit, but we start at level 15. We have our level we start at level 3, then go to 15, 30, 45, 55, and 70. So we have in all 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 different supply crates, meaning that we will have 12 different possible combinations of things that could spawn in an area, right? At any time, any of the supply crates can spawn, so we need to be able to set this up for 12 different possibilities, so on and so forth. So the first thing that we do down here in our supply crate spawning volume is we're going to create entries for our crate templates. So on this map, I'm not editing any of the blueprints, but let's just say I was. We can double click here. You would create a copy before you actually change anything, right? You don't want to have to re-download the ARK dev kit. But if you had the desire, you could come through and change anything that you want in here. I'm not going to go through everything. There are any number of booleans and number points to set. Primarily the ones that people typically mess with are levels. So we can set a required level to access. So I double clicked our level 3 double. So that's the crate that's white and has the gold ring around it. And we have to have a level requirement of 3. And if you really want to, you can set a max level to access. So if you are creating a starter area on a map, right? You want to have a PvP map where people can come in and start and get levels without being harassed by the elder statesmen of the server, so to speak. You can make it so the older people can't access these supply drops. So if you wanted to change this supply, the max level that you could get this supply to 25, anybody over 25 can't access it. But I'm not going to change any of these. I'm going to strictly use the standard vanilla setup. So I'm not going to change any of them. But it's just a heads up, if you so choose, you can change them if you'd like. But in our first linked supply crate entry, we're going to go ahead and set up our level 0 scorched earth. So under crate template, if we click here, it'll compile for a second and take a while to load because it is the ARK dev kit. And once it does load, it'll provide us a list of available crates for us to select that could potentially spawn at any number of spawning locations, which we'll set later. There we go. So now that it's spawned in, we can see that we have all these different combinations of possible loot-based chests. But in this case, we want scorched earth 0, 3, just like this. Supply crate underscore level 3 underscore scorched earth. And this is a level 3 supply crate, and it has a entry weight of 1. And the weird thing about entry weight is it's a probability, but it does not add up. So we can make this entry weight heavier or lighter than it needs to be. But for the base level ones, we want these to spawn more frequently. So I'm going to leave it at 1 and lower everything else as we get further and further down. So for example, we have this first element done. We now have 2 elements in this array. Our second one, we're going to look at our supply crates and we're going to select level 3 double. So here we are, supply crate, and then we're going to do underscore level 3 double scorched earth. Now, just like before, it has the same entry weight as the non-double variant, but I don't quite want that. So I'm going to put it at 0.75, just so it's slightly less than the first one, but it still has a pretty high probability of getting selected. And from there, I'm going to go down and do this over and over again. So I'll next go down to supply crate level 15 for Scorched Earth. And again, I'm going to lower this possibility of happening to 0.65. And I'm just going to go down a little bit with every single increment, adding in the potential supply crate entries as I go. As I go down, I'm just lowering the supply crate % chance of happening each time by giving it a lower and lower entry weight, 0.55. And I'm not going to put all of them in there for now. This is just for a proof of concept so you can see that it works. So these are our possible things. Right now I only have crates 0, 3 for level 3 and level 15 set up. You would need to put in all 12 elements here into this crate entries. Just create a new element for each one you're setting up. But more importantly, we need to set some of our starting values here. So we'll get to spawn points in a second. Trust me, we'll get back to that and create some elements in this array. But I want to do a quick rundown on what the typical number values of something of this might be. I've set up one that has an instantaneous spawn just so we can prove that it works on the island we've been working on. But for this one, I'm going to set it up with the actual numbers. So when you're creating your map, you can set it up with traditional numbers as well. So at any given time on an island this small, and this is still a fairly large island, I'm going to end up making this a lot shorter, but this is still a fairly large island, but it's not large in the grand scheme of the map like this island is over here or the main center island there. This is a fairly small island, so on this particular island, the max number of crates I want in this entire spawning volume is 1. And I want to set up a delay before the first crate. So 30 seconds into my map, I want there to be I want the first crate to have a chance to spawn. And I'm going to extend that out to 1.5 minutes. So the max amount of time before a crate spawns is 1.5 minutes. This can stay at 5. The interval between crate spawns, I'm going to put at 60. The max interval at 150. Then the interval between max crate spawns at 60 and 180 for the max interval between max crate spawns. This is basically setting your max in things just so your probability doesn't get too whack and just leave somebody really unlucky all the time. Your SP interval between crate spawns, you can leave at 0. I don't really care about any of that. SP delay before the first crate, I can leave at 0. I don't really care about that. The minimum crate distance from a player, I'm going to set at 1,000. Keep in mind that our map is probably 50,000 wide, so we don't want it to spawn directly on the player. We want the player to have to adventure out and get to something. And likewise for a structure, I'm going to set it to 8,000. That's just pretty standard. That's what they use on the island in the center. You can change that with server settings if we so choose later. No valid spawn recheck on interval, I'm going to set to 5. And minimum time between spawns of the same type, I'm going to set at 1800 because we really want there to be a variance in the crates that are spawned. And then if you need there to be a sub-level loaded. So if you have a floating island or a cave, you need to have that loaded if it's spawning a crate. And again, I want to make this climbable. We want to enable collision, and a custom tag is just for you to know what it is. So I just want to put this as island B, just so I know ahead of time. I'm also going to put this as _B, just for me later. Put it as, oops. Just for me later when we're doing actual things on the map. And then prevent on it now. We don't need to change any of that. It's all good. That's all good. And we're good. So now that we've set all that up, we've set up everything except for our linked spawn point entries. And we need to come up here to our modes. So Shift F1 if you're on a different mode. And we're going to be looking for something else. You can just search huge and it'll come up. But server side point huge. This is just the point for the server to understand that there's something here and something can spawn. So this is a spawn point for one of our boxes that we're gonna use. So the server side point huge is just a way for the server to know, hey, something is happening here. That's all it is. So in this particular case, we're going to use these server side points to dictate to the server where we want to spawn our crates or our supply drops. So we don't need to change anything about these. We just need to have them exist. So this is a B server side point huge, and it's a supply drop. So this is where our folder comes in handy, because otherwise we don't know what this is. And we're just going to create a couple of these, just so there's a few variations and options. We have 4 different options that can spawn on this island. They're all above the ground because I haven't touched this island yet, but that's okay. So we're going to go back up to our spawning volume for this second island. We're back here, and we're going to go to our linked spawn point entries. So we're going to create an element here, and we'll see that it says 8 members. You don't need to worry about that. Instead, we're going to click on this linked spawn point thing, and we're going to find in our list everything that we have active in our scene now. So, if you have too many things open, we can go to our windows and look at our levels. So as I open things, the more things appear in this list. So if you have too many things open, you can close some of them. We really only need our supply drops open. So we can look at our linked spawn points. For element 0, we're going to choose B0. So the first B spawn point. And we don't need to change anything about this. Just leave that at none. Spawn point weight 1. We're going to leave all the spawn point weights at 1. But just like before, how we were talking about how the weight affects which spawn crate is shown on the actual map, I'm going to set this so certain locations are more likely to have a spawn appear than other locations. So on low level islands where we want the player to start, let's minimize this. On islands where we want the player to start, such as over here or on this island up here, these are going to be standard starting locations for the player. We want to select spawn locations that are closer to the beach because that's more likely where the player is going to be. So we'll set a higher spawn point weight on those spawn locations that are closer to the beach, and a lower spawn point weight on those locations that are higher up on the island, so that the supply drops go towards the beach more frequently than they go higher up on the island. On a higher difficulty island like this, I'm just going to leave them equal, let chance decide. I don't particularly care. On an island where we have sort of a mix, but it's more high stress, high difficulty things, like our center island here, we may have the higher spawn point weights closer to the center, so the player has to adventure more. But for right now, we're just going to leave these all at 1. So we don't actually have to change anything on this element that we've created. We're going to create another element, and we're going to put our second one in. So spawn point 2, a third element, and a fourth element. So our third element, spawn point 3. And our fourth element, spawn point 4. So now we have 4 spawn points, one of which every 30 to 90 seconds will drop a supply crate. It can't drop the same supply crate more than once every 1,000 seconds. And you'll need to touch up those numbers if you're using less supply crates. So in our actual thing, we won't use 4 supply crates. We'll use all 12. And maybe up to 14 if we use some of the like cave spawns or like the supply crate that has saddles in it. Saddles is one of these possible supply crates. You have somewhere between 10 to 14 different spawn crate entries. And those will all have their own individual timer. So if you are using fewer, this minimum time between spawns at the same level needs to be lower. But if you're using somewhere between 10 to 14, 1800 is a good variable to set here. If you're doing fewer, so if you only have 6 spawn crates, I would suggest something around the range of 600. Then you should be good. But with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and test this out. I'm not going to move the spawn over here to this island. I'm going to just test it out on this island over here. I've done a similar setup. I have 3 beach spawning locations set up into my spawning volume. I have 3 elements here. Each element is linked to a beach spawning location on island A1. And you can see the various spawning locations on the map. I've set my start point right here. We're going to go ahead and go back to our levels. And we're going to turn on our static meshes, rivers, and foliage just so it looks a little nicer when we hit play. And we'll see, and we'll get to test these spawning crates. So we'll go ahead and hit play. And it can sometimes take a while because the ARK dev kit is slow. And here we'll just give ourselves infinite stats. And we'll allow ourselves to fly. And we can see on this one, on our details in the bottom right, we'll see that I've set the delay before the first crate to 2 seconds and the max delay to 5, just because I wanted this to illustrate that it actually does work and everything works properly. If we go up in the air and look over at our second island, we should see now that it's been about 30 seconds, our first supply crate is going to spawn. And I should note that it's 30 seconds upon touchdown. So you could theoretically have one start to drop at like 10 seconds and then land at 35 or land at 45, so on and so forth. But we can see that over there we have a supply crate dropping. It looks like it's a level 3 supply crate, a white one. Here we have our blue one, and they take probably 35 to 40 seconds to land, so we're going to have to wait just a little bit. I'll skip ahead in the video to where it's getting close to touching down. And you'll notice as we're getting close to this supply crate, and it's getting close to the ground, we can hear that the sound is working. We can see that the particle effects are working. We can see that this is a level 25 double crate, so this is a pretty low chance of spawning initially. That's fine. I'm going to add experience. Alright, so I've added enough levels that I should be able to open this when we get down to the ground. We can access the inventory, transfer everything out, and it even has the deconstruct and disappear animations. And eventually, if we waited long enough, another one would spawn, and we'd be good to go. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. It really does help us out. And hopefully we'll see you next week.